Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy 2022. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Kalisha Davis, and I am the CS Equity Curriculum Project Director at Kapor Center. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here for the fifth and final webinar and our 5-part series within a series examining each one of the core components articulated in the culturally responsive and sustaining computer science framework released by Kapor Center in June 2021. There's a copy of that just in case. As many of you know, Kapor Center is a national organization headquartered in Oakland, California, dedicated to removing barriers in STEM education and tech careers for Black, Latinx, Native American, and other historically marginalized communities. Next slide, please. Part of what we've established as an organizational practice at Kapor is the acknowledgement of Indigenous communities that have held relationship with the land that our organization occupies and the historical and ongoing legacy in this country of colonialism that has spanned for generations. We hope to engage our colleagues, partners, and communities in discussions, events, and activities to elevate liberatory practices for communities that have been historically marginalized and continue to be marginalized throughout the United States. Next slide, please. With that said, this webinar is a virtual convening created to inform the Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative, a national endeavor launched in early 2020 designed to cultivate meaningful approaches to creating more culturally responsive, asset-based, and sustainable practices in K-12 computer science education. To learn more about our work, please visit our website, where you can download our strategic framework, view a variety of related materials, and find other ways to stay connected. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will unpack the following. In just a moment, I'll share a brief overview of the CRCS framework and these 2 core components, just to offer some context. Kapor Center CEO, Dr. Allison Scott, will offer some introductory remarks to set the tone for our discussion. For our panel this afternoon, we're really pleased to connect with 4 amazing thought leaders with important and unique perspectives on the many sides of community building and computer science education. Finally, we'll save some time for questions from our audience before we close. While you're listening, if you have any questions for us over the course of this presentation, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address as many as we can. Next slide, please. In June of 2021, we released the first iteration of a comprehensive framework that offers insights to the field while underlining the critical need for culturally responsive and sustaining practices within K-12 computer science classes. This work lends to an intentional and persistent investment in Black, Latinx, Native American, and other historically marginalized students and communities. And this resource is research-driven and developed and reviewed by a national collective of well-informed and recognized leaders in the fields of K-12 computer science education, racial equity, social justice, community building, technology, and other relevant disciplines. Next slide, please. The CRCS framework offers 2 key elements: a shared definition of culturally responsive computer science pedagogy, and an articulated set of core components for implementing culturally sustaining computer science pedagogy in school communities. Next slide, please. This slide articulates our shared definition that aims to move beyond simply providing access to computer science courses to ensuring that every student has the opportunity to be inspired and thoughtfully engaged in ways that speak to their interests, identities, culture, and validate their place in the computer science classroom, as well as the entire computing world. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates our 6 core components. We hope that each of these will serve as a resource for educators and help directly inform their instructional practices, curriculum development, and approaches for implementing equitable opportunities for K-12 computer science education. Next slide, please. This takes us to the 5th and 6th core components of our framework. The 5th component, displayed here, encourages educators to thoughtfully consider how to incorporate families and communities in the design of computer science curricula, classroom, and learning opportunities. It also emphasizes that families and community members are an intentional part of the fabric of student experiences. Next slide, please. And the 6th component involves engaging a diverse group of experts into the classroom, setting up for a range of community members, entrepreneurs, and tech leaders to help expand students' assumptions about computing and other career pathways, to help them identify new role models that speak to their identities, and to allow them to explore other ways to be involved in their community as leaders and even change agents. Next slide, please. So where does that intentional effort to broaden students' horizons and focus on the value of collective impact begin? Let's explore this with my colleague and the CEO of Kapor Center, Dr. Allison Scott. Allison.
Thank you so much, Kalisha, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us at our final webinar in the series. So today we are very excited to be joined by another fabulous panel of experts who we will hear talk about the ways that they engage families and communities into computer science education and provide us with some examples about how educators can engage more deeply with families and communities to create more meaningful learning experiences. So as I think about these 2 final core components, and we had some great discussions in the process of developing the framework about these 2 core components, I thought about two things in particular. So one is Louis Moll's seminal research on funds of knowledge, which talks about the richness and the value in the knowledge that students bring to the classroom from their families and their communities. And this is such seminal research because it's in opposition to more traditional deficit models about thinking about how do we engage parents and communities and families to get them to better understand computer science. I would argue, how do we build upon this framing and think about the assets that they already have? What are their institutions? What are their cultural practices? And how do we ensure that computer science aligns with these assets? So I think that's the role for computer science educators to move beyond traditional deficit models into thinking about funds of knowledge that communities and families bring. And the second thing that I'm reminded of is the importance of role models. So we've all seen a ton of scholarship about the importance of representation, whether it's by race, by gender, sexual orientation, community, geography, and how do we inspire young people to pursue specific subjects or careers. And there's research from our colleagues out of University of Washington around, and I believe also from UCLA around, who is a computer scientist and who do young people think of when they think of computer science? How do we disrupt these stereotypes? How do we put more counter stereotypical role models in front of these young people who change their perspectives about what computer scientists look like and what they do? And then what are different fields that computing can be used in, and what are pathways? What are the different pathways to tech careers, and what are opportunities beyond working at Facebook? So as demonstrated in the framework, we believe that these components are essential to creating truly equitable and culturally responsive computing experiences. And in fact, I would argue that we won't find success in the broadening participation movement or in closing equity gaps and increasing the success of students of color if we overlook these critical areas. So I will stop there, and I am excited to learn more from our panelists about the ways that they have found success incorporating families, communities, and role models into CS classrooms. Back to you, Kalisha.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for providing that really important context. I think that's wonderful to be able to think critically about science of knowledge and the importance of role models, because that's exactly what we're here to discuss this afternoon. So let's move on to our wonderful panel. Please allow me the privilege of introducing our 4 distinguished guests. First is Maria Casao. She's a program officer for the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, or AISES. Marie is a member of the Narragansett. No, I can't pronounce
Narragansett.
Narragansett. Thank you so much, Marie. I should just ask you to pronounce that for me, please. Tribe of Rhode Island, but she was born and raised in California. Marie attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, where she received a bachelor's degree in liberal studies with her emphasis in general science education. It was at California Polytechnic where Marie first learned about AISES and later became the treasurer for the university's AISES club. She later earned her teaching credential at California State University, Bakersfield. Marie has experience working in public schools and also in her local tribal communities, tutoring and teaching at the K-12 level. She recently contributed her knowledge to the Fresno American Indian Health Project, designing and teaching virtual STEM lessons to their youth. And Maria completed her master's in education for curriculum and instruction at Fresno State in the spring of 2021. Welcome, Marie. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next is Dr. Nicole R Howard, Associate Professor in the School of Education's Department of Teaching and Learning at the University of Redlands in Redland, California. Dr. Howard is also the co-director of the Race and Education Analytics Learning Lab and the Center for Educational Justice, where she engages students in quantitative and mixed methods research projects that allow them to critically examine systems, policies, and practices as they seek change within their various professional contexts. Welcome to you, Dr. Howard. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next is Alatunde Shabomahim. Tunde is the CEO and co-founder of Street Code Academy, a Silicon Valley-based nonprofit that offers free tech classes to communities of color. Street Code Academy is one of the fastest growing organizations in the region, growing from 20 students in its inaugural class of 2014 to now serving more than 2,000 students annually with over 40,000 hours of free instruction. His work in tech education and community building has earned him recognition as a 2018 Aspen Institute Scholar, a 2019 Praxis Fellow, and a 2020 Social Entrepreneurship Fellow at Stanford University. Tunde is also a beloved member of our Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative's National Advisory. Welcome back, Tunde. And finally, we have Carla Strickland. Carla is a digital curriculum developer at UChicago STEM Education. She led the author side digital team for the 4th edition of Everyday Mathematics, incorporating dynamic geometry and mathematics software into the curriculum and managing all issues related to technology use, classroom implementation, and the design, development, and testing of the curriculum's digital platform. Carla joined the UChicago STEM Education Group in 2011 after completing her work on the 3rd edition of the University of Chicago School's Mathematics Project, their secondary textbooks. And her current NSF-funded STEM plus C project, which I'm going to drop into the chat for you all, aims to develop learning trajectories, illustrative activities, and curricula for integrating computer science and computational thinking into K-5 mathematics. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so we're going to, now that we've done our introductions, we're going to switch our screen so we can see our wonderful panelists. Hello again, everyone. And let's get started with our conversation. So I thought it might be best for us to focus a bit on the elephant in the classroom right now. And that's what's happening in schools across the country that have been struggling with like a number of different types of reactions and responses to the surge of COVID cases related to this latest variant. What resonates with you right now about this situation? And anyone is welcome to share their thoughts.
Go ahead, Marie. Go ahead.
Yeah, just the schools we've been working with, we notice they've been struggling. I have a lot of friends who are still teachers and they're really struggling. Our tribal communities have been decimated, lots of deaths just constantly happening, lots of elders losing of, their languages, just irreparable damage basically that's happening to a lot of these communities. So some of the communities we do service, we're trying to be like, all right, second semester, let's, help you all out. And they're just like, I don't have the capacity right now. Like, we are just trying to stay afloat. Tomorrow our school might go virtual, or nope, they're sticking it out in person, and they just are just floating, trying to get through. So I've noticed that across the board with a lot of the interactions I've been having with teachers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Marie. Just one follow-up for you. Are schools able to pivot at all through are there adjustments that they're making as they experience these challenges with this latest variant?
Yeah, it depends on the school site. Like, one school site is just toughing it out, staying in person, even though like half the staff is gone and a third of the kids are gone, or half the kids are gone. They're just toughing it out. Other schools have said, nope, we're just switching back for at least 2 weeks and then we'll see from there. So it really just depends on if it's a public entity, what state they're in, if they're a tribal community, so they can kind of make their own decisions based upon, their tribal community. If they go on lockdown, they can put their school virtual. So it really varies from site to site and what type of school entity it is.
Okay. Tunde, you had something to share about what's resonating for you?
Yeah, a couple of things that you said, dovetail nicely with what to me is one of the more hurtful things about this pandemic, which is a very difficult time for everyone. And it's that parents and teachers have been positioned in opposition to each other. And when there are so many teachers that are also parents, right? And, so many parents that are also teachers, even if it's not in the school that their child is attending. That's really hard because parents and teachers substantially comprise the community that's most connected to and responsible for the health and well-being of children. And so I feel like by positioning parents in opposition to teachers, and I'm using positioning because I do feel that this is sort of a way to deflect from what is a failure of our social safety net. Right, I feel that institutions are the ones that have the resources and the responsibilities to make sure that that on a grand scale, when it's things that affect all of us, that there are supports in place to help us. But by pushing it to parents versus teachers, who wants the school to be open, who wants the school to be closed, who doesn't want to work, it's become very individualized, which we're not surprised about because we're in this very capitalistic situation. But as we think about culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, and we talk about community and involving parents and students, it's really these groups that are already in the same community that is primarily responsible for children's health and well-being that need to work together, right, in service of not just health, but also learning to make sure that our kids are all right. Because they're our kids, they're not the kids. Now the institutions can say those kids are the kids, right? But parents and teachers have to say our kids. And so I really I'm hoping that the more we talk about it and the more time goes on, that we can realize that parents and teachers are not opposing each other. We all love the kids, right? And that it's the institutions that we have to hold accountable to use their resources to handle the responsibilities, to help us surmount this obstacle that is facing everyone, or even not surmount it, but get through it.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that, Carla, and I think there's definitely a need for all these various groups to come together, because that is what, especially in the media, that parents and teachers are positioned in opposition of one another, as you suggested. How can school communities rally together? Because that involves everyone. That's families, that's community members, that's students. Like, what are some of the ways that they can work together towards some form of a solution in a time that's just really challenging?
That's a good question. I will say that I do think that communication is really important. One of the things that, so I'm in Chicago, and I mean, maybe you have heard that it's big bacchanal here with the teachers union and the city and Chicago Public Schools. And one of the things that was done, even while the negotiation was ongoing, is that the Chicago Public Schools, the city was able to cut off communication between parents and teachers by locking teachers out of the online portal. It means that parents are sitting at home saying, I haven't heard anything from the teacher, because the teachers literally could not access the email or the system that had that communication. So I think we all realize that this situation is really desperate, and it's on parents and teachers to try to fill in what the institutions have control over and take back the control over the communication, whether it means that you need to collect private email, personal email addresses for your parents so that you're not just relying on your institution email address, whether it means that there's a text chain, whether it means that you're using a Facebook group, or you have, all the parents may not want to give you their number, but there may be some parents who can form a network in the classroom who may have access, who can send things out on the text chain. And I think if we can, just to start with the communication issue and not rely on the institutions to handle that, then that's one way that we can start moving towards, community, because community, I think, relies on communication.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there was an interesting article that was published in Wired on Monday about how students are mobilizing around these particular issues. And I asked the question because it relates to what you just said, Carla, around communication, and then using various forms of, social media, phone, different forms of communication for folks to be connected, because that's what students are, that's exactly what they're doing, to put together these walkouts and protests, and calling their, their school community administrators and leadership, calling the community out to ask for exactly what they need. What can we learn from these student demonstrations and walkouts? And this question is open to our full panel.
Oh, go ahead, Nicole, please. So I think what we can learn, and I really appreciate, thank you for the question, Kalisha, and thank you, both Maria and Carla, for your words. One of the things that stuck out to me, Carla, was about the positioning between, them versus us, and parents versus teachers. I just think that's a really toxic, false narrative that we could fall into. And one of the things that we learn from students in these walkouts that I'm not very familiar with, but just generally speaking, we see a desire for students to want more. We see a desire from students, excuse me, to want better education. And what has hurt me in the pandemic, mainly as a parent and as a small community, a leader of a small community-based organization, right? That's very tapped in, is us, I think, in this false narrative of we're parents and you're teachers, as opposed to we all have the commitment to educate our students. I think we lost an opportunity. I think we're losing an opportunity. And oftentimes we're hearing that classrooms are the safe haven for students. We're hearing that classrooms are the provider of more than just education. They're the provider of mentorship. They're the provider of meals, the provider of safe space. And I felt like the divide between the household and the classroom is a toxic divide. Because if we look at that holistically, how better could it be if we had the conversation that everything should be a safe place for our students. Everything should be a place for us to be able to feed our students. Every place should be and when I hear students saying we want more, it's a call, not just to fix our schools, but to also to fix our homes, to fix our community organizations. Because I was hurt when we're expecting that a school should be the only place that a student should have internet, that a school should be the only place that a student should have free food, that a school should be the only place that that they receive safety. So when we cut the divide and we include it to being home, school, community is one, now we're saying, how do we provide safety in all these places so that when there's a toxic environment or unsafe environment, like what this latest variant provided in our schools, that we can say, well, that safe place is no longer a safe place. Now we can fall back on the safe place of home, because home is equipped to be a place of education as well, because it has the proper internet. And maybe it's not individual homes, but there's a small community, a collective of homes. I just feel like we've lost that opportunity. And in response, what Street Code has done, and I'll end with this, Street Code has done, we hit the pandemic very early on saying, let's give out computers. We've given out over 1,500 computers to our families in our local community. But we advanced it from not just community computers and internet. We also said, how do we give workplaces? Because it's not okay for you just to have a computer and internet and no workplace. So we started giving out desks. And so now we're giving out desks to people to provide them monitors so that you now could have maybe a better home environment to work. And obviously space is hard, particularly in the Bay Area. But I think the intention was something to build on, right? The intention is, how do we build the place of learning, not just to be the classroom, but to also be the home?
I appreciate that, Tunde, focusing on practical solutions, and especially the idea of everyone has the opportunity to teach and learn, both youth and adults. And I think that's something that we certainly need to hold on to in school communities. How might culturally responsive teaching practices make a difference in this environment? Carla, I think you touched on it a bit, focusing on the idea of understanding. But our panelists, what do you all think about the work that you're currently doing and, you know, the gap between what's happening right now?
I can talk a little bit more about it. I will say that one of the big things. So I work on curriculum, and I work with teachers, right? And oftentimes we see, and in elementary school particularly, where students are very young. So when you walk into a classroom, there's often this implied power balance where the teacher is the one in power and the students, are under them, right? We say it's the teacher's classroom, and it implies and sets up this very one-way relationship. Like the teacher is the one giving the knowledge, and the students are the ones receiving the knowledge, and it puts students into a very passive position. And then families then are positioned like the teacher passes through the students to get to the family. So it's like being passive and having an additional degree of separation. And so culturally responsive teaching forces us to elevate the relationship amongst all three of these sort of groups, right? So it's not just teacher to student and student to families. It's also teacher to families. And I think that if we can really communicate that and get teachers and families and students to buy into that, right? It's not just my teacher gave me this note and I'm going to give this note to my family or whatever the communication is. If we can get teachers and families to directly connect with each other, and as they directly connect with students, I think that really helps us to elevate both the communication, which I touched on earlier, and the learning. I know you have other questions, Kalisha, that get more into detail, so I don't want to go on too much on that. But to me, that was one of the more powerful things and easier things to explain to colleagues and teachers and parents who may be trying to figure out what culturally responsive teaching is about. Is elevating those relationships amongst those three groups.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you, Carla. Yeah, encouraging educators to take a step back and inviting everyone to be a part of that learning and that conversation. So let's touch on that a little bit around the role of educators, bringing community together in the classroom and in the school, and the supports they may or may not have to be able to do this and do it well. So this is another question for everyone. What are the initial steps that an educator needs to take to ensure that equity becomes a regular and ongoing practice in their classroom?
I'll jump in here. Just, I think it's really important, and this maybe speaks to what Carla was also talking about. We have to keep the learning posture. I think that's important. So you start with self, but also understand that there will continually be more to learn. Speaking back to the culturally responsive component too, I think about cultural care and learning communities. I think about the importance of being positioned to learn from your students, with your students, not just being teachers teaching, talking at your students. So those are some things that come to mind first, because equity is a mindset. It's not just about actions and reading a book. There's much more to it. And learning posture is learning, for me, is not just taking in information, but it's also applying what I've learned. So I'm speaking of the whole piece with our educators. I think that's a responsibility. Even me in what I do now, I need to maintain the learning posture.
Mm-hmm. Is there a perception that teachers are the ones that need to bridge those gaps and cultivate these relationships? Like, what exactly happens when you in the classroom, when teachers are working with students? We think about, even parent-teacher conferences and other forms of engagement with the public. Like, where do educators, begin? Or where do educators end as far as the role in ensuring that the community is engaged in a certain way and lending their ideas to what students are learning?
I think teachers, they're the main person that is interacting on the ground level with the students. So it is, of course, important that they have that know-how and knowledge and understand the communities that they are servicing. But again, I think it also falls on administrators. If we're talking about school districts as a whole, if you take into account with Native students, there's a lot of schools that still have Native mascots and they don't see the issues of that. And so a lot of Native students are walking in the classrooms where they're being seen and treated as a mascot or a fictional character of the past, of old Westerns, and not modern day. And so when you have a teacher like the Riverside case that happened few months ago now, where she was put on paid administrative leave, but nothing was really done to correct the situation. I'm not sure if she's back yet, but that was a teachable moment for that entire district. And they just kind of were shifting the blame around instead of just saying, you know what, we made a mistake. There's yearbook to prove that she's been doing this for years. And we never thought there was anything wrong with it until a Native student brought it to their attention, saying he was really just upset by the moment, him and other Native students. And so then they tried to crack down, but a lot of these have half-hearted responses or have a lot of community backlash, especially with changing mascots and that sort of thing. So I think, there's a lot of studies to suggest that border town meaning if you're bordering to a reservation, tend to be the most racist towards Native students and just the Native population in general. So we know that there's just a lot of issues that just happen systemically around tribal communities, that it can't just be just the teacher involved, even though that's great, but when we talk about middle school, high school, when they're meeting how many teachers a day, how many aides, how many other people, admin, secretaries in the offices, all these people they're interacting with on the daily, where one person might be, talking for them, and the other person might be that advocate, and another person might be still completely racist. How do you shift that mindset of the entire community as a whole, especially when in a lot of those demographics, even at tribal entities and BIE schools, the teachers are majority white teachers, and they don't even really understand the community. They get to leave the reservation at the end of the day, so they get to walk away, and they don't really truly get to know the community itself. So I feel like it does fall on the individual teacher, but I think, it's not just the teacher, it's everyone around them.
I appreciate that, Marie's shifting the mindset of the entire community. And that requires a pretty heavy lift. Are there organizations and groups in the community that have a bandwidth to be more supportive? Like even in the communities that you serve, Marie, are there examples where that's actually happening?
Yeah, so a lot of, especially for public school systems, most big cities have urban Native centers. Oakland has one up there pretty close. There's a couple other areas here, like I mentioned, Fresno American Indian Health Project, as well as the tribal community themselves. Sometimes they offer an education center. And they do have meetings. They have usually the districts try to have like a parent teacher meeting with just tribal members to be involved. But a lot of that just tends to be lackluster. A lot of that is just for them to get their funding. I believe it's Title VI, if I remember correctly. They just do the bare minimum just to get the funding that they need for having Native students at their schools, because a lot of people don't realize if you have Native school students in your school, you get more money for the district, for the school site, that sort of thing. So it becomes a money game and not much about actually helping the students. So reaching out to those urban groups and the community itself. But again, there's just a lot of, and then COVID, everyone's just kind of been at a standstill, that it's been harder to engage with communities during this time. But they are out there if people are willing to seek it and willing to have open arms. But a lot of tribal communities have that abrasiveness towards the public school system because they've been treated so poorly. So sometimes you just have to you have to want to form a relationship. Like the local school here, the tribe invited them on a bus to go see what the kids have to deal with at 5 a.m, getting on the bus to go down to town, have to go through everybody else's route, then just to get to school. And then they're the last to leave to get back onto the reservation, and make those teachers do that trek and see that's why your student is having trouble paying attention, right? See how far they live once they get on the reservation. Do they have internet access? So, but it takes work on both ends, and it can't be lackluster. They have to want it. So that's the biggest thing.
Appreciate that, Marie. Tunde, based on your experiences offering computer science learning to minoritized students in the out-of-school time spaces, is there a disconnect between the work that you do to reach students and the opportunities offered inside the school walls? Like, what are you hearing from students, from their parents, from even the schools themselves?
Thank you for the question. I'm I'm blown away by the fellow panelists and the comments, and I just want to share 3 things that I can't get my mind around, so I got to say them out loud, and then I'll get to your question. One is this connection that Carla spoke about, this positioning. I think it's so toxic. I just can't. I'm walking away with the articulation of that based on what Carla mentioned. I think that positioning is really important, right? So, and I want to touch base back to that when you talk about what has worked with us and in our community. And I think what Dr. Howard said when she talked about the mindset, right? The posture of learning. And there's a humility in that, and there's automatically a willingness to work with others. And Marie, I'm still just trying to grapple with everything that you mentioned about, I don't want to call it empathy, but just about what teachers could do to understand more these students, and then what I could do, and the security that a student has when they have a community or a tribal community, or you know, even this notion of like who's in the classroom and who represents and who knows you and who doesn't. So I say all that to say I've learned a lot from the panelists, and in our community, I think we have a cheat code in some respects. I think it's unfair a little bit because we're in East Palo Alto, California. We're a self-governed community of color. We have our own city, our own district. It's not well funded. It's not well, positioned. It's overlooked. It's whatever, but it is our own, right? And so the relationship between school and community and homes are not as divided, right, as it would be if we were a pocket of a broader, right? So I think we have a model to share. What happens when the classroom teacher really does know the community centers, right? Really does know the families. And we kind of do have that. I don't know if now is a good time to share the video, but I think it just like, the video just kind of shows, is this now a good time, Kalisha, I can show that?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that, because yes, I had so many questions for you all, and I want to make sure the audience has a chance to ask. So yeah.
I mean, this, I don't want to be selfish with this 1 minute that the video would have, but I think it is like a great, I love it. I love all our videos with Street Code Academy. You can see us on YouTube, but this is like, I just love this video.
You already know the potential inside of you, and we're here to meet you where you're at. No matter your age, it's never too late to learn something new. 80% of our former students have utilized our courses and resources for economic empowerment, improving their employability and livelihoods. Since 2014, our role has been to build the bridge to new potentials and discoveries in tech education. The tools are here for you. The only way to cross the bridge is to take the first step. The time to take action has never been better. Register for your free class today.
Oh, let's see here, sorry.
Love it.
So, yeah, so I just think in there, right, you have, to me, there's, and again, I think we have a cheat code, right? Because we're all kind of, it's not as hard. We don't see ourselves as like after school, or they don't see themselves as like teacher. Like we just see each other like less. And I'm not saying this is a gloss over. I'm not trying to paint this, false narrative of what we have, but there is, I think, a benefit of us seeing students as students, no matter what your age is. And when everyone is seen as a learner, then we've started to do what I think the panelists have articulated. We just feel it, I think, and I'm learning about the articulation of it. There's no barrier between that. And I think if there are any teachers in the audience, I think the thing to learn is, or thing to take away is that, this posture of learning, this humility that comes with that, the breakdown of those separations, like is my role and that's your role, the knowing of the community is very inviting. You can learn from anyone and everyone. Everyone's a student, everyone's a teacher. I could go on and talk about how we've, how the teachers are, how the students, when you have a, I'll just say this one anecdote and I'll end. When you have, remember this, one of the ladies that was on the front picture, her name is Mama Keisha, right? She's 80 years old. She wanted to take her in-person African goods store online. So she's coming to learn online and she's not used to that. So she's like, look, I'm learning coding. You're teaching me basic coding. This stuff is confusing. I'm gonna quit. But she said what stopped her from quitting was she would look across the table and there's a 9-year-old killing it. So she's like, look, I'm gonna learn from this 9-year-old. Now, what does that say to the 9-year-old? The 9-year-old is not the, they're not the mentee, they're the mentor in that scenario, right? And that's a drastic example of how, like, when we break this down, but it took an 80-year-old to say, I'm still a learner. And it took us to be able to say, you're 80 years old and can still be a learner. It took us saying, you can still be an entrepreneur. So all that platform and posturing allowed for this magic to kind of happen when we just simply said, there's no barrier between classroom and this, there's no barrier between age and that. There's no, like, come on, let's all kind of work together. Of course, at times, your 8-year-old need to listen to this 80-year-old who's lived life, of course. But there's sometimes when this 80-year-old is going to get inspired by this 8-year-old. And that kind of diversity and ecosystem is just rich. And I think it provides for, we've learned that provides for a really great learning environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tunde. You said so many things. There's so many gems to unpack. I'll be here another 5 minutes unpacking everything that you just said. So I'm going to ask a question of Dr. Howard. I'm curious from your point of view, because you work with ensuring that educators expand their understanding of how all of this can come together. And the intention is really a long-term kind of goal, right? To achieve certain things in computer science to allow more, Black and Brown students to be at the table and to engage in certain areas that they never even saw themselves being in before. Like, what role do administrators and policymakers, play in allowing this work to be more effective for us to have more of the opportunities to take place in, places like street code, in our classrooms, out of our classrooms, where students of all ages, as he, so thoughtfully demonstrated, can be at the table and take part in all of this?
Well, that's a really good question. So, because sometimes I think that it's okay to get out of the way. When we look at what the students, the kids, the young people were doing on the front lines in the article that you shared, that was because they have experienced what community feels like outside of school. And so now they've built their own community and they're saying, this is where I feel safe. And so this is what I should be feeling there. So I think what comes with that is the listening piece. I often cringe when I hear people say they're doing a listening tour, but I do see the benefits of doing that. Being an administrator willing to listen, not just to your teachers, but also to your students about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And then for policymakers, the same thing. The policymakers I have actually worked with, I'm surprised to see their willingness to listen. And so I would say administrators also creating opportunities. They're supposed to be the role model, right? Role model for the teachers and the students. So how about creating the opportunities and space and moments for students to think about policy too? They're ready to think about policy and to be in the conversations with policymakers themselves about what are the things that need to be changed. So I think administrators really, instead of being the ones to say, oh, let me go and do this for you, they can be saying to students, how can I get you in the room so you can say it for yourself to the people who need to hear this the most, and put them in the rooms with the policymakers? I think that would be powerful. Earlier, I was also thinking about this justice-based approach, right? This justice-based ethical approach to the work that they do. And I feel that that's important for administrators as well. So be genuine is basically what I'm saying. Don't do it because it's again, checking a box, but because it's genuine. It goes back to the notion of the ethic of care. I remember being on a call last week with one of our district folk, and right behind him, he had ethic, grace, and care, like just the words up. Okay, thanks for the reminder to extend grace and to show care. So I think that those are important attributes for our administrators to embody as well.
So our time, of course, is flashing by, and we're like in our last 9-ish minutes. I want to encourage our audience, if you have burning questions, to please drop them into the Q&A so that we can raise those with our fantastic panel. I'll keep us going because I have a question for you, Carla. I know that a lot of your work is in service to younger students, to elementary age students. And I don't want to leave today without touching on what, how communities can continue to serve our younger children, especially when it comes to exposing them to computing and STEM opportunities. Does it look different as far as parent and family involvement? What are some of the more effective approaches to making sure that our little ones aspire to be able to do more in these areas?
Yeah, so I am happy to be here sort of representing for the elementary computer science space. And in this space, there's a lot of integrated curriculum work because it's always about finding time for computer science in the day, right? So I've worked on projects over the last several years that are math plus computer science or science plus computer science. And I do think that the dynamic changes how teachers and students and families relate to computer science. Right now, traditionally, I will say that that's for elementary students and families. Parents, there is an expectation that parents will engage more because, they're children, and we think of them as children, not just students. Even one of our conventions in when we're talking about children in grades 3 or lower, we say children, and then grades 4 and above, we start saying students. But just reminding people that they are children. There's less of an expectation for children to do independent work. In elementary school, parents expect to be involved somehow, but the material is often more familiar to families and parents because the elementary school curriculum is less stratified than secondary curriculum, right? So everyone is taking the same courses. Generally, the same teacher is teaching for most of the day. And parents are like, oh yeah, I learned how to read. I learned how to do math. I learned some science. I know about primary colors and all of these things. You're like, oh yeah, if you ask them what they learned in primary school, there is this sense that, okay, I already know the things that my children are learning in elementary school, which tends to fade over time as students specialize in things that their families may not have specialized in. So I do think that when it comes to computer science, which was not really a thing in elementary schools 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that you now have to deal with the fact that these parents are like, whoa, I don't know that, right? And so it gives you an opportunity. You want to anticipate how parents are going to deal with that novelty, right? And how that novel content relates to others. But I think it's, I do think we need to start earlier if we are going to counteract some of the things Marie was talking about, and you were talking about earlier, Felicia, about ideas that kids already have about computer sciences and what's for them to know and who's an expert in this and that kind of thing. Because past middle school, a lot of times that identity is already formed. Kids have made up their mind. It's a lot harder to change. It's easier, in theory, to change it earlier. So I think that as teachers and families, and we as the computer science education community, think about this. We want to take advantage of that because getting in earlier helps us to work on computer science identity, what students think computer science is and who computer scientists are. And also these children have a right to interact with computers in a way that does not just relegate computers to tools of entertainment or utility. There is so much more to computer science than just, oh, I use a computer to play a game, or I use a computer to do my job. And so as we move towards more integrated curriculum, in the elementary school, we see computers being used in the arts and other things like that. So it's more creative. It's not just this utility or this game orientation. And I think that's really powerful and important. It really has bearing on our work that we need to do to impact computer science identity in young kids.
So start early, allow young people to be little ones to be grounded in these particular areas so that they can aspire to do more as they get older. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm trying to determine what last question I want to ask you all while we're all together. I guess a final question, because I would love to hear from all of you. What are the most important lessons that you've learned as you've done this work over the years about making culturally responsive practices in education real and sustainable? Like, is there something in particular that you haven't already shared, or even just reiterating some of the lessons, some of the things that you've reflected on that can offer a nugget to educators, to community organizations that might be watching today's presentation, to take with them as they think about how to serve young people and their families? And yes, please. I was just asking Marie.
Yeah, I would say some suggestions I have. This happened recently in November, and I don't think a lot of people knew this happened, but there was a Tribal Nations Summit that happened. It's all on YouTube. It looks really daunting. It's like 4-hour pieces, but a lot of it is because they're getting different tribal nations to come in to talk about each different topics. And they have a section where they talk about education in tribal communities, and they have leaders from different, we have over 574 federally recognized. That's not including state or unrecognized tribes. So we have such diverse communities that even though we just always get lumped together, which is very unfortunate because they have such beautiful cultures. And there was also a White House Tribal Youth Forum that also happened a couple days later. So if you look those up on YouTube, those are amazing. If you just kind of want to get a broad sense of what's happening with MMIW movement, what's happening in education, what's happening, with the youth, Indigenous sciences, recognizing that that's an actual legitimate form. The APA guides now recognizing that you can have Indigenous knowledge as being a proper source to cite in academic papers. That's a great thing. So people have been starting to do more for these communities and trying to, we're trying to infiltrate a lot more because we have a lot of Indigenous scientists that are just amazing professors, leaders, scientists, all these things. So I think just taking all that in and just learning about the broad community, because we get left out a lot because we're statistically insignificant in a lot of things, and you don't see us mentioned in broader topics and broader discussions. So just taking that time to learn about these communities and what sovereignty is. People don't understand what sovereignty is, and that's a huge part of being a part of a tribal nation and a citizen of a tribal nation. Like I'm a part of a sovereign nation. I'm a citizen of my nation. I have a separate, ID that's just as valid as my, state ID card, right? But a lot of those aren't taken into account by everyday people. So I think the more we can learn about that in general, the better off we'll be for helping these communities.
Thank you, Marie. Dr. Howard?
I think I would just like to leave the reminder that our students have varying degrees of familiar relationships. And so as we talk about community and family, just knowing that the decisions and the choices that we make have a lasting impact beyond just what we see right in front of us, that what the decisions we make now about how we support them within their community or how we engage with building community, that it affects them well, as Carla said, starting early, but it affects them well into adult life. So just leave with that reminder to be aware of our actions and aware that family dynamics can differ for every student.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Carla?
I'll be quick. For teachers that are here, I know sometimes it might feel like culturally responsive pedagogy or whatever recommendations are coming down. Seem like just another thing to do on an already full plate. But this particular dimension of cultural responsiveness, which is this connection with families can help with this. You don't have to sit by yourself and go outside of your textbook, which is, beholden to whatever the page count the publisher has. They can't put 80 examples. They can put maybe one or two. The families, your students' families are a source of, they're an asset. They're a source of material, giving you choices about how to present the material, what you highlight, what students learn, how they learn it. And if we can make this happen, it helps alleviate that burden. So it's not just another thing for you to do. By incorporating families, it helps alleviate what you already have to do.
Love it. Thank you, Carla. And Tunde.
No, I just want to say thank you, everyone. And it's important work. Jesse Jackson said years ago that tech, education and equity is going to be the civil rights issue of our era, because it really allows communities to access financial resources. And so I think equitable computer science education is important. And that's all. It's that important, right? I think so. The hard work that it takes and the frontier. I love that Carla mentioned that it wasn't even around in our generation, right? So this is very new. We're on the frontier of it. If we can get this right, let's work to do that. It's important. It's not trivial. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for this discussion. A special thanks to our amazing panel. I sincerely appreciate your time today. And we look forward to continuing these conversations related to creating equity and computer science education in classrooms across the country with all of you in the future. So stay tuned for what we have coming up next. We look forward to connecting with you again soon. All right. Thank you all so much.